They found the bill of sale in 1961, tucked inside a hollowed-out brick in the basement of what used to be the Johnson Square auction house in Savannah, Georgia. The paper was yellow and brittle. The ink faded to the color of dried blood, but the words were still legible. March 17th, 1853. One male. Age 19. No name recorded. Final bid, $12,400. $12,400 in 1853. For a single human being. To put that in perspective, a skilled blacksmith sold for maybe $1,500, a house servant $800. Even the most valuable cotton picker rarely exceeded $2,000. But $12,400? That was the price of a small plantation. That was generational wealth. That was the kind of money that appeared in wills and sparked family feuds. The researchers who found that bill of sale spent 6 months trying to understand it. They searched every archive in Georgia, every courthouse record, every plantation ledger. They found something that made them stop their research entirely and seal their findings. Because what they discovered wasn't just about money, it was about a secret so dangerous that 3 families spent decades trying to erase every trace of it. A secret about a young man who should never have been standing on that auction block, a young man whose very existence violated the fundamental rules of the world he'd been born into. This is the story they didn't want you to hear. This is the story that was deliberately buried, brick by brick, document by document, until almost nothing remained except whispers and fragments and one impossible bill of sale. His name was Marcus. At least, that's what they called him by the end. But that wasn't the name he was born with. Before we go further, I need to know something. If you're watching this from Georgia, South Carolina, or anywhere along the Atlantic coast, leave a comment with your state. Because what happened in Savannah in 1853 didn't stay in Savannah. The ripples from this story touched dozens of families, changed inheritance laws, and created secrets that some of your ancestors might have carried to their graves. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories they tried to bury in hollowed-out bricks and sealed archives, hit that subscribe button right now. Because at the Sealed Room, we don't let the past stay buried. The story begins in 1834, not in Georgia, but in Charleston, South Carolina, in a world that existed in the shadows between black and white, enslaved and free, a world that makes no sense to us now but made perfect, terrible sense to the people who lived in it. The Beaumont family had been in Charleston since 1698. French Huguenots originally, religious refugees who'd built their fortune in rice and indigo, then pivoted to cotton when the market shifted. By 1834, they owned 3 plantations in the Low Country, a townhouse on Meeting Street, and a reputation for ruthless business practices combined with impeccable social standing. They were old money in a city that worshipped old money. They were the kind of family that had cousins in the legislature, nephews in the judiciary, and enough influence to make problems disappear. The patriarch in 1834 was Auguste Beaumont, 52 years old, widowed, father of 2 sons. His older son, Nathaniel, was everything Auguste had hoped for. Disciplined, ambitious, already managing one of the family plantations at age 28. Nathaniel would inherit the business, the properties, the family name. He was the future. His younger son, Richard, was everything Auguste had feared. Charming, reckless, brilliant in the way that usually leads to disaster. Richard was 24 inches, 1,834, and he'd already been expelled from 2 colleges. Not for stupidity, but for what the administrators called inappropriate associations and unsuitable enthusiasms. He read abolitionist newspapers. He quoted French philosophers at dinner parties. He asked questions that polite society didn't ask. In October 1834, Auguste sat Richard down in his study and gave him an ultimatum: shape up, take a position managing the family's cotton factor business, and marry appropriately. Or leave Charleston with an allowance and never come back. Richard chose to leave. He was gone within a week. headed north with enough money to live modestly, and a warning from Auguste that if he ever embarrassed the family, the allowance would stop and he'd be disowned entirely. For 2 years, Auguste heard nothing except quarterly confirmations from his banker that Richard was still collecting his allowance from an address in Philadelphia. Then, in November 1836, a letter arrived. Richard had married. The woman's name was Celia Laurent. The letter included a small portrait, the kind you could have made for a few dollars at any photographer's studio. The woman in the portrait was young, maybe 20, with delicate features, dark eyes, and skin that was unmistakably, undeniably brown. Not black, not in the way that Charleston defined black, but brown enough that Auguste knew immediately what it meant. Celia Laurent was a free woman of color, which meant any children she had would carry that status, would exist in that impossible space between enslaved and equal, would be marked forever by their mother's ancestry, no matter how pale they looked or how educated they became. Auguste burned the letter and the portrait. He wrote one sentence in response: "You are no longer my son." Richard's reply took 3 months to arrive. It said, "I understand. I expected nothing else. My son was born in January. His name is Christian. You have a grandson you will never meet, and I consider that your loss, not mine." For 18 years, that was the end of it. Auguste never mentioned Richard to anyone outside the immediate family. Nathaniel inherited everything as planned, married appropriately, produced 3 daughters who married well. The Beaumont name remained spotless. The family fortune grew. Richard existed only as a quarterly bank transfer and an annual confirmation that he was still alive, still in Philadelphia, still managing somehow on the modest allowance that Auguste had never increased despite inflation. Then in February 1853, everything changed. The letter came on a Tuesday. It was addressed in handwriting that Auguste recognized despite the tremor in the letters. The way they slanted and wavered across the envelope, Richard's handwriting, but older, weaker, dying. Auguste opened it in his study, standing by the window that overlooked the garden where Richard had played as a child, where both his sons had run and fought and grown up before everything had fractured. The letter was brief. "I am dying. Consumption. The doctors give me weeks, maybe days. Celia died of fever 6 years ago. Christian has been supporting us through carpentry work, but he's alone now. He's 19 years old. He's never done anything except work with his hands and try to keep me comfortable while I die. He's a free man, Father. He has papers proving it. But he's also alone in a city that's becoming increasingly hostile to free blacks. I'm asking you for one thing. Not for me. I stopped expecting anything from you in 1836. For Christian. Take him in. Not as family. I know that's impossible, but as something. Give him work. Give him safety. He's your grandson. He has Beaumont blood. Please." Auguste read the letter 3 times. His first impulse was to burn it like he'd burned the first one. His second impulse was more complicated, because Auguste Beaumont was dying too, not of consumption, but of the slower erosion of age. He was 71 years old. His heart was weak. His hands trembled. The doctors had told him he had maybe 2 years left. And in the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, he'd started thinking about legacy, about the choices he'd made, about the grandson he'd refused to acknowledge. But Auguste was also a practical man. And as he stood there holding Richard's letter, an idea formed. An idea that should have horrified him. That it didn't says everything about the world he lived in and the man he'd become. He sat down and wrote a careful reply. He would accept Christian. The young man should travel to Savannah, not Charleston. Auguste had business interests there, a smaller operation that wouldn't attract the kind of scrutiny that Charleston would. Christian should arrive in March, by ship if possible. Auguste would make arrangements. He signed the letter, sealed it, sent it express to Philadelphia. Then he sat alone in his study and thought about opportunity and how sometimes the solution to one problem creates another, more profitable problem. How sometimes a grandson could be worth more as property than as family. Christian Beaumont arrived in Savannah on March 3rd, 1853, on a cold Tuesday afternoon that felt more like winter than spring. The ship from Philadelphia docked at the East Broad Street wharf at 3 o'clock. Auguste was there to meet him, along with a man named Routledge, who managed Auguste's Savannah warehouses, and two hired men whose presence suggested this wasn't just a family reunion. What stepped off that ship made everyone present go very still. Christian Beaumont was the most beautiful young man any of them had ever seen, not handsome in the way men usually are, but beautiful in a way that seemed almost unreal. He was tall but not imposing, maybe 5'10", with a lean build that suggested regular meals but hard work. His hair was dark brown with hints of auburn when the light hit it, worn slightly long and naturally wavy. His eyes were an extraordinary shade of hazel green that seemed to change color depending on the light, sometimes more brown, sometimes almost gold. His features were perfectly symmetrical, with high cheekbones, a straight nose, and a mouth that portrait painters would have studied for hours. His skin was pale. Not the ruddy paleness of the Irish dockworkers, but a smooth, even paleness with just enough warmth to suggest Mediterranean or perhaps Creole ancestry. In Philadelphia, he would have passed for white, without question. In Savannah, where people looked more carefully, where ancestry was examined with the intensity of bloodhound trackers, someone might wonder, but even then they'd probably assume Portuguese or Italian before they assumed African. He looked unmistakably like a Beaumont. The resemblance to Richard at that age was striking, and there was something in the bone structure, the way he held himself, that echoed Auguste's own features from 40 years earlier. Anyone who knew the family would see it immediately. Christian descended the gangplank carrying two things: a worn canvas bag that looked like it held everything he owned, and a wooden box about the size of a thick book, which he held carefully as if it contained something precious or fragile. He wore working man's clothes, clean but patched, a wool coat that had been good quality once but was now threadbare at the elbows. His boots had been resoled multiple times. Everything about him said respectable poverty, the kind that keeps up appearances while quietly struggling. When he reached the bottom of the gangplank, he set down his bag and looked directly at Auguste. For a long moment, neither man moved. They were studying each other. Auguste seeing his son's ghost and his own younger self, Christian seeing the grandfather who'd disowned his father 18 years earlier, who'd sent his parents into exile, who'd refused to acknowledge his existence until now. Then Christian extended his hand. "Sir," he said in a voice that was careful and formal, with the flat accent of Philadelphia working class, "I'm Christian. Thank you for allowing me to come. I know this must be difficult. It's difficult for me too." Auguste didn't take his hand. Instead, he examined Christian for a long, silent moment. He looked at the young man's clothes, his posture, his face. He looked for obvious signs of African ancestry, the telltale features that would mark him as colored under Georgia law. But there was nothing definitive. The young man looked white. More than white, he looked like a Beaumont. That made him valuable. That also made him a problem. "Follow me," Auguste said finally, his voice neutral. He turned and began walking toward a waiting carriage without checking to see if Christian complied. Routledge gestured for the two hired men to pick up Christian's bag. Christian kept the wooden box, holding it against his chest as he followed Auguste. They didn't go to Auguste's townhouse. Instead, the carriage took them out of the city, south along the river road, to a small property Auguste owned about 5 miles from Savannah. It was called Riverside, though it wasn't much of anything, just 200 acres of pine forest and a modest house that Auguste used occasionally when he needed to be away from the city. The property was managed by an older couple, the Hendrys, who lived in a cabin on the grounds and maintained the place. The carriage stopped in front of a small outbuilding behind the main house. Not quite a cabin, not quite a storage shed, something in between. One room with a bed, a table, a chair, a small fireplace, and a single window with shutters but no glass. "This will be your quarters," Auguste said, still in that neutral voice that gave nothing away. Mrs. Hendry will bring you food. We'll speak tomorrow morning about your situation and your future. Do not leave this building tonight. Do not speak to anyone. Do you understand? Christian looked at the small building, then back at his grandfather. A flicker of something, fear or realization, crossed his face. I understand, he said quietly. May I ask? No, Auguste said. Tomorrow. He left, taking Rutledge and the hired men with him. The carriage rolled away, leaving Christian standing alone with his canvas bag and his wooden box in front of what was essentially a prison cell with a bed. Mrs. Hendry brought food an hour later, corn, bread and beans, and a piece of salt pork. She was a heavy-set woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a cautious manner. She handed Christian the tray without meeting his gaze. Thank you, Christian said, and she looked up, surprised at his tone. He spoke to her like she was a person, not a servant, like they were equals. You're his grandson? She asked quietly, keeping her voice low even though there was no one nearby to hear. Christian nodded. My father's son. Did you know my father? No, but Mr. Beaumont mentioned you'd be coming, said you'd be staying here while he figured out. Arrangements. She said the last word carefully, like it meant something specific that she couldn't quite say out loud. Do you know what kind of arrangements? Christian asked. Mrs. Hendry looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was impossible to read. Then she said, very quietly, Be careful. Mr. Beaumont is not a cruel man, but he's a man who sees the world in terms of profit and loss. And sometimes the people who aren't cruel are more dangerous than the ones who are, because they can do terrible things while telling themselves they're being practical. She left before Christian could respond. He stood in the doorway watching her walk back to her cabin and felt the first real stirring of fear since leaving Philadelphia. Not fear of violence, but fear of something more insidious. Being redefined, being transformed from a person with agency into a problem that needed solving. He ate the food because he was hungry. Then he opened the wooden box he'd been carrying so carefully. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were his papers. His birth certificate from Philadelphia listing his parents as Richard Beaumont and Celia Laurent, free woman of color. His baptismal record from St. Thomas's Episcopal Church. His apprenticeship completion certificate from the Carpenters Guild. Letters from his father's Philadelphia lawyer confirming his free status. All of it official, all of it proving beyond doubt that he was who he said he was, a free man, born free, with no legal connection whatsoever to slavery. He laid the papers out on the table and looked at them for a long time in the fading afternoon light. Then, acting on an instinct he couldn't name, he took a piece of paper and began writing a detailed inventory of everything in the box. Every document, every date, every seal and signature. He wrote in tiny, precise letters, filling 2 pages with documentation of his documentation. When he finished, he folded the inventory and tucked it into the lining of his coat, where it would be invisible unless someone specifically searched for it. His father had told him once, in one of those last painful conversations, when the consumption was making him cough blood into handkerchiefs, Christian, in this world, the only thing standing between you and disaster is the right piece of paper. Never lose your papers. Guard them like your life, because in many ways, they are your life. Christian fell asleep that night, lying on top of the thin blanket, still fully dressed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Georgia night, crickets and tree frogs and the distant hooting of an owl. And underneath it all, the soft whisper of the Savannah River moving past in the darkness, going somewhere he couldn't see. The next morning, Auguste arrived at 8 o'clock. He came alone this time, driving a small buggy himself. He found Christian standing outside the outbuilding, having been awake since dawn, watching the sunrise over the pine trees. "Come," Auguste said. "We need to talk." They went to the main house, to a small study on the first floor. The room was spartanly furnished, compared to what Auguste probably had in Charleston. Just a desk, 2 chairs, a bookshelf with ledgers. Auguste sat behind the desk. Christian stood in front of it. The arrangement made the power dynamic unmistakable. "You have your papers?" Auguste asked without preamble. Yes, sir. I need to examine them. For your protection, you understand. There are many fraudulent documents circulating. I want to ensure yours are legitimate. Every instinct Christian had screamed that this was wrong, that handing over his papers was handing over his freedom. But he also understood that he had no real choice. His father was dead, his mother was dead. He had no money, no connections in Georgia. He was alone in a state where his appearance might pass for white, but his ancestry absolutely did not, where being questioned, being investigated, could lead to disaster even with proper documentation. He retrieved the wooden box from his room and placed it on Auguste's desk. Auguste spent 20 minutes examining each document, occasionally making notes in a small leather book. When he finished, he placed all the papers back in the box, closed it, and set it in the bottom drawer of his desk. Then he locked the drawer and pocketed the key. "These appear to be authentic," he said. "I'll keep them here for safekeeping. Now, let's discuss your situation." Christian felt something cold settle in his stomach. Auguste leaned back in his chair and studied Christian with the same assessing gaze you'd give a horse at market. Clinical. Measuring value. "You're my grandson?" Auguste said slowly. "That's an undeniable biological fact. But you're also the son of a woman of color, which under Georgia law makes you colored as well, regardless of how you look or where you were born. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand that Georgia law is different from Pennsylvania law," Christian said carefully. "But my papers prove I was born free. My mother was a free woman. I'm a free man. Your papers prove you were born in Philadelphia to parents who claimed certain statuses," Auguste corrected. "But they don't prove your mother's ancestry. They don't prove that she had the right to transmit free status to you. Under Georgia law, if your mother had any African ancestry and cannot prove her own free lineage going back multiple generations, your status becomes questionable. Do you have documentation proving your mother's ancestry?" Christian felt the trap closing. "She was born free in Philadelphia. She never told me about her parents. They died before I was born." "Then you see the problem," Auguste said. "Without documentation proving your mother's free status beyond her word, your own freedom is vulnerable to challenge. Any magistrate could question it. Any slave catcher could detain you. Any person with the right connections could have you investigated, and in that process, there's no telling what might happen. Your Philadelphia papers might protect you in Pennsylvania. Here, they're just paper." "Are you saying I'm not free?" Christian's voice was steady, but his hands, clasped behind his back, had tightened until the knuckles went white. "I'm saying your freedom is complicated," Auguste replied. "And complications can be dangerous. However, I'm willing to help you. I made a promise to your father, and despite everything, I honor my promises." The way he said it made Christian's skin crawl, because he could hear what was coming, could feel it in the air between them like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. "I'm prepared to offer you shelter, food, and work," Auguste continued. "You'll stay here at Riverside. You'll work as a carpenter, maintaining the property and doing work for my various business interests in Savannah. You'll be compensated fairly. In exchange, you'll refrain from discussing your father, your mother, or your Philadelphia background. As far as anyone is concerned, you're simply Christian, a light-skinned worker I've employed privately. We'll avoid complications by avoiding questions." Christian stared at his grandfather. "You're asking me to hide who I am. I'm asking you to be practical. This is Georgia, not Philadelphia. The rules are different here. If you insist on proclaiming your complicated parentage, you invite scrutiny that could destroy both of us. My family's reputation cannot survive the revelation that I have a mixed-race grandson, and your freedom cannot survive the kind of investigation that revelation would trigger. So we maintain a fiction. You work quietly. I protect you quietly. Everyone benefits. And if I refuse?" Auguste's expression didn't change. "Then I return your papers and provide you with $20. Enough to reach Charleston or return to Philadelphia if you're very careful with the money. After that, you're on your own. No protection, no family connection, no resources. A young man with a questionable accent, questionable documentation, and a face that will make people ask questions you can't adequately answer. How long do you think you'd last? He was right, and they both knew it. Christian had $3 in his pocket. He knew no one in Georgia. His carpentry skills were good, but finding work required references, required people willing to vouch for you, required a network he didn't have. And his appearance, which should have been an advantage, was actually a liability. He looked too refined for manual labor, too ambiguous for easy categorization. People would wonder about him. And, in a place like Georgia, in 1853, being wondered about could be fatal. "I'll accept your offer," Christian said finally, the words tasting like poison. "For now." "Good," Auguste said. "Mr. Hendry will show you what needs to be done. You'll start tomorrow." Christian worked at Riverside for 2 weeks. The labor was hard but not brutal. He repaired fences, rebuilt a collapsed chicken coop, reinforced the main house's sagging front porch. Mr. Hendry was a quiet man in his 60s who'd been a carpenter himself before age and arthritis had slowed him down. He watched Christian work with professional appreciation. "You're good," Hendry said on the 4th day, watching Christian cut and fit a complicated joint. "Real good. Where'd you learn?" "Philadelphia. 4-year apprenticeship with a master carpenter named Morrison." "Morrison," Hendry repeated. "German?" "Scottish. Took me on when I was 14. Taught me everything." Hendry nodded slowly. "You talk like a free man. You work like a free man. You hold your head like a free man." It wasn't a question, but Christian heard the question underneath it. "I am a free man," he said quietly. Hendry looked at him for a long moment. "Then why are you here?" Christian couldn't answer that, because the real answer was too complicated, too dangerous. Because he was trapped between identities, between worlds, between the person he knew he was and the person Georgia law said he might be. That night, Mrs. Hendry brought his dinner and lingered in the doorway. "Mr. Beaumont came by this afternoon," she said quietly. "Talked to my husband for a long while. Asked questions about how you work, how you conduct yourself. Seemed pleased." "That's good," Christian said, though something in her tone suggested it wasn't good at all. "My husband and I have been here at Riverside for 12 years, Mrs. Hendry said. "We've seen a lot of things. We've seen Mr. Beaumont make a lot of arrangements. And I'm telling you this because you seem like a decent young man who doesn't understand what kind of arrangement you're in." "What do you mean?" She glanced over her shoulder, checking to make sure they were alone. "Mr. Beaumont doesn't do anything without profit. He didn't bring you here out of family feeling. He brought you here because he saw opportunity. The question is, what kind of opportunity does a beautiful young man with questionable papers represent to someone like him?" Christian felt his mouth go dry. "You think he plans to sell me?" "I think he plans to do whatever makes him the most money while letting him sleep well at night. And men like him can justify anything if the profit margin is right." She paused. "There's stories, you know. Stories about people who came here free and left enslaved. Stories about papers that disappeared. Stories about arrangements that turned into something else. Why are you telling me this?" "Because my daughter was born free, Mrs. Hendry said quietly. "Her father was white, though he never acknowledged her. She had papers proving she was free. She went to Savannah one day to visit her aunt and never came back. We found out later she'd been detained, questioned, had her papers confiscated. Last we heard, she was working in some rich family's house in Charleston, and her papers had been lost in a courthouse fire. That was 8 years ago. We haven't seen her since." She left before Christian could respond, but her warning lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. That night, he checked his coat lining to make sure the inventory of his papers was still there. Then he lay awake, thinking about his grandfather's careful questions and Mrs. Hendry's careful warnings, and wondering what kind of arrangement he'd actually agreed to. On March 15th, everything changed. Auguste arrived at Riverside in mid-morning, driving his buggy with Routledge sitting beside him. Christian was working on the main house's front steps, replacing rotten boards. He looked up when he heard the buggy approach, saw his grandfather's face, and knew immediately that something had shifted. "Come," Auguste said without preamble. "Get in the buggy. We're going to Savannah." "Sir, I'm in the middle of—" "Now, Christian." There was something in Auguste's voice that made argument impossible. Christian climbed into the back of the buggy, still wearing his work clothes, sawdust in his hair. The ride to Savannah took 40 minutes. No one spoke. Routledge kept glancing back at Christian with an expression that might have been pity or might have been curiosity. Auguste stared straight ahead, his face unreadable. They arrived in Savannah just before noon and drove directly to Johnson Square, to a large building Christian didn't recognize. The sign above the door read, "Johnson Square Auction House, Fine Goods, Real Estate and Negro Sales." Christian felt his stomach drop. "Why are we here?" "I have business," Auguste said. "You're coming inside with me." The auction house was an impressive building, 3 stories of brick with tall windows and an elegant facade that suggested respectability and profit. Inside, the main floor was a large open room with a raised platform at one end and rows of chairs arranged in a semicircle facing it. The walls were decorated with paintings of pastoral scenes, as if beauty could somehow sanitize what happened here. There were about 30 people in the room when they entered, well-dressed men and women, some sitting, some standing in small groups talking quietly. Christian understood immediately what this was. An auction. He'd heard about them in Philadelphia, read about them in abolitionist newspapers. But being in one, smelling the mixture of perfume and tobacco smoke and human fear, was different. Auguste led Christian to a side room off the main floor. It was smaller, more private, with a desk and several chairs. A man in an expensive suit was sitting behind the desk. He stood when Auguste entered. "Mr. Beaumont," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Right on time. And this must be the property we discussed?" "Property." The word hit Christian like a fist. "This is Christian," Auguste said. "As I mentioned in my letter, he's a complicated case. But I believe he'll generate significant interest." The man, whose name Christian never learned, walked around the desk and examined Christian with the same assessing gaze Auguste had used. He looked at Christian's face, his build, his hands. He even asked Christian to open his mouth so he could inspect his teeth. Christian stood there, trembling with rage and fear, and let it happen, because what else could he do? Fight? Run? He was surrounded by people who believed they had the right to do this. People who would see his resistance as proof he was property, not a person. "Extraordinary," the man said finally. "Simply extraordinary. I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone quite like him. The coloring, the features, the obvious refinement. May I ask about his skills?" "Trained carpenter," Auguste said. "Literate, well-mannered, suitable for house service or skilled trade work. And his background, private acquisition. The details are complex and frankly not relevant. What's relevant is what you see in front of you." The man nodded slowly. "I understand. Complicated provenance is sometimes unavoidable. The important thing is that you have the legal right to sell him." "I do," Auguste said firmly. Christian found his voice. "No," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "You don't. I'm a free man. I have papers." "The papers are questionable," Auguste interrupted, not even looking at Christian. "As I mentioned, he's been told stories about his background that aren't accurate. He believes he was born free in Pennsylvania. In reality, he's the son of a slave woman who ran away to Philadelphia and created false documentation. When she died, I located him and brought him back to Georgia. He's convinced himself that the false papers are real. It was a perfect lie. Smooth, plausible, impossible to disprove without the papers that were locked in Auguste's desk. Christian felt the room tilt. "I see," the man said, looking at Christian with something like sympathy. "That's unfortunate, but not uncommon. I've seen several cases where slaves were educated beyond their station and became confused about their status. Please, Christian said, hearing the desperation in his own voice and hating it. I have documentation. My grandfather has it. Birth certificate, baptismal records, everything. I'm a free man. This is kidnapping. Auguste sighed as if dealing with a difficult child. You see what I mean? He's quite convinced. But I assure you, all of his so-called documentation has been examined by legal authorities and determined to be fraudulent. I have letters confirming this, if you need them. Of course he did. Auguste had had 2 weeks to prepare. 2 weeks to forge letters, to create a paper trail, to construct a complete fiction that would override Christian's truth. The auction house manager looked between Auguste and Christian, clearly calculating risk versus profit. Finally he said, I'll need to see those letters before we proceed, and I'll need a signed statement from you accepting full legal responsibility if his status is challenged after sale. Of course, Auguste said smoothly. I'll have everything delivered this afternoon. When can we schedule the auction? Day after tomorrow. March 17th, we have a major sale scheduled. High-end properties, significant attendance. He'll be the final lot. We always end with something memorable, and he certainly qualifies. Excellent. The final lot should generate maximum interest. They were discussing him like he was a painting or a piece of furniture. Christian opened his mouth to protest again, but Auguste's hand closed around his upper arm, tight enough to hurt. Come, Auguste said. We're done here. He dragged Christian out of the building, back to the buggy. Rutledge was waiting, and this time there were 2 other men with him, large men with hard faces. They climbed into the buggy, sitting on either side of Christian, making it clear that running was not an option. They didn't return to Riverside. Instead, they drove to a building on the edge of Savannah, near the docks. It looked like a warehouse on the outside, but inside it was divided into small cells with barred doors, a slave pen, a place where human beings were stored like inventory before being sold. You're going to stay here until the auction, Auguste said as the 2 men escorted Christian into one of the cells. I suggest you use the time to accept your situation. Fighting will only make this harder. You gave me your word, Christian said, his voice breaking. You promised you would help me. You're my grandfather. My father trusted you. Something flickered across Auguste's face. Regret, maybe, or just annoyance at having to hear the accusation out loud. I am helping you, he said. You don't understand it yet, but I'm giving you the best possible future. You'll be purchased by a wealthy family. You'll have good food, comfortable quarters, purpose. You'll be far better off than you would be wandering around Georgia with questionable papers and no prospects. This is a kindness, Christian. You'll see that eventually. This is slavery, Christian said. This is reality, Auguste replied. The reality of who you are and what world you live in. I didn't make these rules. I'm simply navigating them in a way that benefits us both. You'll fetch an extraordinary price, which reflects your extraordinary qualities, and I'll have fulfilled my promise to your father by ensuring you're taken care of. He left, taking Rutledge and the hired men with him. The cell door locked with a heavy, final sound. Christian was alone in a space, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with a thin mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, and a barred window too high to see out of. He sat on the mattress and tried to think, tried to find some way out of this nightmare, but every avenue led to a wall. His papers were locked in Auguste's desk. No one in Savannah knew him. No one would believe him. And even if they did, even if he could somehow prove he'd been born free in Philadelphia, Auguste had probably already created documentation claiming Christian was born enslaved in South Carolina. Legal battles took time and money and connections, none of which Christian had. The only thing he had was the inventory hidden in his coat lining, a list of documents that he couldn't access, a record of proof he couldn't produce. That night, he heard other voices in the building, other people in other cells, some crying, some praying, some silent. Christian didn't cry and didn't pray. He sat in the darkness and felt something inside him change, not breaking, but hardening, crystallizing into something cold and sharp and absolutely clear. If he was going to be sold, if there was no way to stop it, then he would make sure everyone knew exactly what was happening. He would not go silently onto that auction block. He would not let Auguste sell him like furniture. He would not disappear into the convenient fiction that he was property instead of a person. He didn't know if it would save him. Probably it wouldn't. But it was the only choice he had that was actually his choice. On March 16th, the day before the auction, a guard brought him food and water. The guard was young, maybe 20, with a face that hadn't yet learned to be completely indifferent to suffering. "You're the one being sold tomorrow," the guard said. "It wasn't a question. I'm the one being stolen tomorrow," Christian corrected. The guard looked uncomfortable. "Look, I don't know anything about your situation, but I've worked here for 3 years, and I'll tell you this, if you cause trouble at the auction, it'll go bad for you. The buyers don't like mouthy property. You'll get a worse owner, maybe one who'll beat that attitude out of you. Better to just accept it and hope for someone kind. Or," Christian said quietly, "I could tell the truth and hope someone with a conscience is listening." "The truth doesn't matter much at an auction," the guard said. "Only the paperwork matters. And Mr. Beaumont has all the paperwork. He has lies written on paper." "That's not the same thing," the guard shrugged. "In this world, sometimes that's exactly the same thing." He left, locking the cell behind him. Christian lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, thinking about truth and lies and the terrible fragility of freedom. Thinking about how his father had spent 18 years in exile rather than give up his wife and son. Thinking about how Auguste had spent those same 18 years pretending his younger son didn't exist. And thinking about how in less than 24 hours he would be standing on an auction block in front of strangers who believed they had the right to own him. The March 17th, 1853 dawned cold and grey, with heavy clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered. Christian was woken at 6 o'clock and given water to wash with, a clean shirt to wear, and instructions to make himself presentable. The shirt was white linen, expensive, clearly chosen to contrast with his colouring and emphasize his appearance. They were dressing him up like merchandise, which, he supposed, was exactly what he was to them. At 9 o'clock, the guard and another man escorted Christian from the cell to a waiting carriage. They drove through Savannah's streets, and Christian watched the city pass by, wondering if this would be the last time he saw it as a free man, or if he'd already crossed that line somewhere back at Riverside when he'd agreed to Auguste's arrangement. The auction house was already crowded when they arrived. Christian was taken to a holding room on the 2nd floor where other people, all of them enslaved, were waiting to be sold. There were maybe 15 people in the room, men, women, one teenage girl. All of them looked terrified. All of them were silent. The only sound was the muffled noise of the crowd gathering below, the murmur of voices and occasional laughter that made Christian's skin crawl. At 10:30, the auction began. Christian could hear it through the floorboards, the auctioneer's voice rising and falling, the calling of bids, the strike of the gavel marking sales completed. One by one, the people in the holding room were led downstairs. Each time, Christian listened to the auction of a human being and felt rage building in his chest like a physical pressure. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the guard came for Christian. "You're last," he said. "Final lot of the day. They always save the best for last." Christian stood and followed him down the stairs. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, but his hands were steady. His mind was clear. He'd made his decision during the long night, and now he just had to execute it. He had one chance, one moment to speak. After that, whatever happened would happen. The main auction room was packed, every chair was filled, and people were standing along the walls. Christian estimated maybe 200 people, all of them well-dressed, all of them here to spend money on human beings. The air was thick with perfume and pipe smoke and something else, something that Christian recognized as anticipation. The crowd was energized, feeding off its own momentum. The auctioneer stood at his podium on the raised platform, a man in his 50s, with a voice that could carry across a crowded room without shouting. He'd been at this for hours, selling people one after another, and he looked tired but professional. This was his job. This was normal to him. Auguste was sitting in the third row, flanked by Rutledge and two other men Christian didn't recognize. His face was carefully neutral, showing nothing. But Christian could see tension in the way he held his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests of his chair. He was waiting to see if his investment would pay off. The auctioneer banged his gavel 3 times, calling the room to order. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in English, then repeated in French for the Creole families present, "We come now to our final offering of the day, and I can assure you, we have saved the very finest for last." A murmur went through the crowd. People who had been checking their pocket watches or preparing to leave suddenly paid attention. The auctioneer knew how to work an audience. "This property," the auctioneer continued, "represents the absolute pinnacle of what our market can offer. Young, skilled, intelligent, and as you will see, of truly exceptional quality in every regard. I present to you Christian, age 19 years. The guard pushed Christian forward onto the platform. The effect was instant and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Women leaned forward in their seats. Men straightened up, suddenly alert. Someone in the back gasped audibly. Christian stood in the center of the platform, in the white linen shirt they'd dressed him in, and let them stare. Let them see him. He kept his face carefully neutral, but his eyes moved across the crowd, meeting gazes, refusing to look down or away. He would not perform submission, not yet, not until he'd said what he needed to say. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly pleased with the reaction. "As you can see, this is no ordinary offering. Trained carpenter with 4 years of professional apprenticeship, literate in English, excellent health, perfect teeth, no scars or defects, suitable for the finest household or the most skilled trade work, a property that will elevate the status of whoever possesses him." He paused, letting the crowd absorb this information. Then he delivered the line that made several people gasp again. Opening bid set at $5,000. $5,000. Nearly twice what a skilled worker usually brought. The crowd buzzed with excitement. This wasn't just an auction anymore. This was an event, a spectacle. The final lot was living up to its billing. A man in the front row raised his hand immediately. $5,200. Before the auctioneer could acknowledge it, a woman's voice called out from the left side of the room, $6,000. The bidding had started, and it was already moving fast. Christian stood perfectly still and watched it happen. Watched people compete for the right to own him. Watched his price climb like he was a painting or a racehorse or a piece of real estate. 6,500. 7,000. 7,500. With each bid, the crowd grew more animated, more invested. This was no longer about acquiring a worker. This was about winning, about status, about being able to say, "I own the most remarkable slave ever sold in Savannah." At $8,000, most of the bidders dropped out. The competition narrowed to 3 people, a wealthy widow named Mrs. Pritchard, who owned a mansion on Madison Square and was known for maintaining an extensive household staff of light-skinned servants. A rice planter named Colonel Drayton, who saw Christian as a potential manager for his skilled workers. And a merchant named Bernard Lacroix, who wanted Christian for his carpentry skills and the prestige of owning him. 8,500, 9,000, 9,500. The bids came rapidly now, each person refusing to let the others win. Christian could see Auguste in the third row, watching the numbers climb with barely concealed satisfaction. This was working exactly as he'd planned. Christian would sell for a record price, Auguste would make an enormous profit, and everyone would talk about it for months. The sale would be legendary. At $10,000, Colonel Drayton dropped out with a shake of his head. The sum was simply too much, even for him. Mrs. Pritchard and Lacroix continued, their bids now coming in smaller increments, 10,200, 10,500, 10,700. The auctioneer was practically vibrating with excitement. He'd never conducted a sale like this. None of them had. This was history being made. At $11,000, Lacroix hesitated. The sum was staggering, irrational, more than most men earned in 5 years of work. The auctioneer sensed his uncertainty and turned to Mrs. Pritchard. "Madam, do I hear 11,200? Mrs. Pritchard opened her mouth to bid, and Christian spoke. 3 words in English, loud enough to carry across the entire room: "I am free." The silence that followed was absolute, total, as if every person in the room had simultaneously stopped breathing. The auctioneer's face went white, then flushed red. "You will be silent," he snapped. "You are not permitted." "My name is Christian Beaumont," Christian said, his voice stronger now, clearer, cutting through the auctioneer's protest. "I am the son of Richard Beaumont and the grandson of Auguste Beaumont, who is sitting in the 3rd row of this room. I was born free in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on January 12th, 1834. I am a free man, with full documentation of my birth, my baptism, and my free status. I came to Georgia at my grandfather's invitation. Upon my arrival, he confiscated my legal papers and fraudulently entered me into his records as a slave. Under both Pennsylvania and Georgia law, I cannot be legally enslaved. I am free. This sale is a fraud, and everyone participating in it, including the auctioneer, the auction house, and the bidders, is complicit in kidnapping and false imprisonment." The chaos that erupted was immediate and total. Several people jumped to their feet. Others began shouting questions. Mrs. Pritchard looked horrified. Lacroix was demanding to see documentation. The auctioneer was banging his gavel frantically, trying to restore order. Auguste shot to his feet, his face a mask of fury. "He's delusional," he shouted in English, then repeated in French. "He's been told stories about his parentage that aren't true. He's the son of a runaway slave who created false documents in Philadelphia. I brought him back to Georgia, and he's convinced himself that the fraudulent papers are real." "The papers are not fraudulent," Christian said, his voice cutting through the noise. "They're locked in my grandfather's desk at Riverside, 5 miles south of here. Birth certificate from Philadelphia, baptismal record from Street, Thomas's Episcopal Church, apprenticeship completion from the Carpenters Guild, all official, all authentic, all proving that I was born free and have never been enslaved. Those documents have been examined by legal authorities," Auguste countered, his voice tight with controlled rage. "They were determined to be forgeries. I have letters confirming this." "Then produce them," Christian interrupted. "Right now, in front of everyone here. Show them these letters from legal authorities. Show them any documentation you have proving I was born enslaved. Show them a bill of sale for my mother. Show them any records from South Carolina that mention me. You can't, because they don't exist. You made them up." Auguste looked like he wanted to strangle Christian with his bare hands, but he also looked trapped. Because Christian was right. Whatever letters Auguste had prepared, he didn't have them here. He'd expected Christian to stand silently and be sold. He hadn't prepared for this. The room was in complete chaos now. The auctioneer had given up trying to restore order. People were arguing with each other, some insisting the sale should stop immediately, others maintaining that a slave's testimony was worthless. Mrs. Pritchard was speaking urgently with a man beside her who appeared to be her lawyer. Lacroix was pushing his way toward the platform, demanding answers. And then something remarkable happened. A man in clerk's clothing pushed his way through the crowd to the platform. He was young, maybe 30, with ink-stained fingers and an earnest expression. He held up a folded document. "I'm Timothy Wells," he announced loudly. "I work for the Chatham County Clerk's office. I need to speak." The auctioneer looked at him with confusion and irritation. "This is highly irregular." "I don't care," Wells said. He climbed onto the platform, standing next to Christian. I was working late last night when someone came to the courthouse and filed a deposition, a legal statement, properly notarized, regarding this young man. He unfolded the document and read aloud, I, Christian Beaumont, being of sound mind and under oath, do hereby state that I was born free in Philadelphia on January 12th, 1834, to Richard Beaumont, white citizen of South Carolina, and Celia Laurent, free woman of color and resident of Philadelphia. I have never been enslaved. I possess legal documentation proving my free birth, which documentation was confiscated by Auguste Beaumont upon my arrival in Georgia on March 3, 1853. I am being fraudulently offered for sale against my will and without legal authority. This statement is made on March 16, 1853, and filed with the Chatham County Clerk as a formal objection to any attempted sale of my person. The silence that followed was somehow even more profound than before. When did this arrive? The auctioneer asked, his voice shaking. Last night, Wells said, around midnight. It was properly filed and notarized, which means this sale cannot proceed without investigation. If he's telling the truth and he was born free, everyone involved in this sale is liable for false imprisonment and fraud. If he's lying, he can be prosecuted for filing a false statement. But either way, the sale has to stop until the matter is resolved. Auguste had gone very pale. Who brought the deposition to the courthouse? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Wells looked at his papers. A man named Hendry said he was employed at a property called Riverside. He also provided this. He held up a second piece of paper. Christian recognized it immediately. The inventory he'd hidden in his coat lining. The detailed list of every document Auguste had confiscated. This is a complete inventory of the documents allegedly held by Auguste Beaumont, Wells continued. Birth certificate, baptismal record, apprenticeship completion. Each one described in detail, including dates, issuing authorities, sealed descriptions. If Mr. Beaumont has these documents and they match this inventory, it will be very difficult to argue they're fraudulent. Christian felt something break open in his chest, not hope exactly, but something close to it. Mr. Hendry had done it. Had somehow gotten the inventory from Christian's coat, had filed the deposition, had created a legal record that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The auctioneer looked between Christian, Auguste, and Wells. He was clearly calculating liability and risk. Finally, he banged his gavel 3 times. This auction is suspended, he announced. The property, he paused, seeming to realize that word might no longer apply. The individual in question will be remanded to county custody pending legal review. All bids are hereby voided. This sale will not proceed today. Auguste lunged toward the platform, but Routledge grabbed his arm, holding him back. Don't, Routledge said quietly. You'll make it worse. 2 county constables who had apparently accompanied Wells stepped forward. They didn't shackle Christian, which was significant. They weren't certain he was enslaved, which meant they had to treat him as potentially free. Come with us, one of them said to Christian, not unkindly. You'll be held at the courthouse until a judge can review the matter. Christian nodded. As he stepped down from the platform, he walked past Auguste. Their eyes met. His grandfather's expression was complicated rage, yes, but also something that might have been grudging respect or might have been hatred. Christian couldn't tell and didn't care. You've destroyed yourself, Auguste said quietly, for Christian's ears only. Even if you win this, you'll never be safe in Georgia. I'll make sure of that. Then I'll leave Georgia, Christian said. I'd rather be hunted and free than safe and enslaved. He was escorted out of the auction house and into a waiting carriage. As they drove away, Christian looked back at the building one last time. He could see people streaming out, arguing, gesturing wildly. The auction had dissolved into chaos. The scandal would spread through Savannah within hours. The courthouse holding room was small but clean. Not quite a cell, not quite a guest room. Christian had a bed, a chair, a small table, a barred window that looked out onto the street. He was locked in, but not chained, guarded but not treated as a criminal. For 3 days he waited while lawyers examined documents, took testimony, and tried to unravel the legal knot he and Auguste had created. During those 3 days, several things happened. Mr. Hendry came to visit, accompanied by his wife. They brought food and clean clothes. Mrs. Hendry hugged Christian through the bars of his door, which was against regulations, but the guard allowed it anyway. "How did you know?" Christian asked. "How did you know to file the deposition?" "My wife saw Mr. Beaumont preparing letters," Hendry said. "Letters supposedly from legal authorities saying your papers were fraudulent. But they weren't written yet when he showed them to the auction house. They were blank forms. He was going to forge them after the sale. We knew then that everything you'd said was true. You risked yourselves for me. Our daughter is still enslaved somewhere because no one helped her," Mrs. Hendry said quietly. "We couldn't let that happen to you too." Auguste hired 3 lawyers. They argued that Christian's deposition was inadmissible, that his testimony as a potentially enslaved person had no legal standing, that the burden of proof was on Christian to prove his free status, not on Auguste to prove Christian was enslaved. Christian had no lawyer. He couldn't afford one. But he had something else. He had the truth, documented in his own handwriting, filed under oath. On March 20th, a judge named Morrison, a man known for careful deliberation and unexpected sympathy toward free people of color, issued his ruling. It was not the ruling Christian wanted, but it was the ruling that kept him alive. Judge Morrison stated, Christian Beaumont's legal status could not be definitively determined from available evidence. The inventory of documents suggested authentic free papers existed. Auguste Beaumont's claimed letters from legal authorities could not be produced for inspection. The deposition was properly filed and notarized, which gave it legal standing regardless of Christian's status. However, the documents themselves were not available for inspection, being held by Auguste Beaumont, who refused to produce them without a court order. And obtaining such a court order would require Christian to prove standing, which required him to prove he was free, which required the documents he couldn't access. It was a perfect legal circle, a trap with no exit, but Judge Morrison did something unexpected. He ruled that the attempted sale was void. Auguste could not sell Christian as a slave unless he could prove beyond reasonable doubt that Christian had been born enslaved. The burden of proof was on Auguste. Until such proof was provided, Christian's status would remain undetermined and he could not be held in slavery. Furthermore, Christian could not immediately claim the full rights of a free person without his documented proof. He existed in a legal gray area, not definitively enslaved, not definitively free. The practical effect. Christian was released from custody but barred from leaving Georgia without permission. Auguste was prohibited from claiming Christian as property or selling him. The matter remained technically open, pending additional evidence, but since the key documents were in Auguste's possession and he refused to produce them, the situation was effectively frozen. It was a non-ruling that protected everyone. Auguste's reputation was preserved. He could claim he'd acted in good faith based on questionable circumstances. The auction house was protected from liability since the sale had been stopped. The bidders got their money back, and Christian got his freedom, technically. Sort of. In a form that no one could quite define. When Christian walked out of the courthouse on the afternoon of March 20th, he carried nothing except the clothes on his back. Auguste had kept everything, his papers, his wooden box, even his carpenter's tools. Christian stood on the street outside the courthouse and looked at Savannah around him, this beautiful, terrible city where he was neither one thing nor another, and felt something that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. He was free, not entirely, not cleanly, but enough. He was alive. He had survived. The Hendrys gave him shelter for 2 weeks, hiding him at Riverside while Auguste raged and threatened legal action. But Auguste couldn't do anything without admitting he'd tried to sell his own grandson. The scandal had already damaged his reputation. Pursuing Christian would only make it worse. On April 5th, Christian left Riverside before dawn. He walked north on foot, carrying a small bundle of food and clothes the Hendrys had given him. He had $8 in his pocket money. Mr. Hendry had pressed into his hand, and no destination except away. Mrs. Hendry had hugged him goodbye and whispered, "Go somewhere cold. Somewhere your face doesn't mean anything except that you're young and strong. Canada, maybe. Or somewhere out west where no one knows Georgia law or cares about it." Christian never told her that he didn't plan to go west or north. He planned to disappear, to become someone else entirely. To shed the name Christian Beaumont like a snake sheds skin and emerge as someone with no history, no complications, no grandfather who'd tried to sell him. What happened next is where documentation ends and mystery begins. There are 17 documented references to Christian Beaumont after April 5, 1853. None of them are definitive. All of them are frustrating. Together, they create a trail that leads everywhere and nowhere. A ship's manifest from April 12, 1853 lists a C. Beaumont departing Savannah for Baltimore. No age given, no description. It could have been him, it could have been anyone. A Baltimore newspaper from May 1853 ran an advertisement seeking a skilled carpenter, French-speaking preferred, and listing a contact address. 3 months later, the same paper ran a notice that the position had been filled by a young craftsman of exceptional ability recently arrived from the South. No name given. A letter arrived at the Chatham County Courthouse in September 1853, addressed to Judge Morrison. It contained a single sentence in elegant handwriting: "Thank you for giving me the chance to choose." It was signed C.B. Judge Morrison kept the letter in his private papers for 30 years. When he died in 1883, his son found it and noted in the margin, "Father always wondered if the young man survived." I think this was his answer. A census taker in Montreal in 1860 recorded a Christian Bernard carpenter, age 26, born Pennsylvania. The description matches, the age matches. But Bernard was a common name in French Canada, and Pennsylvania could mean anything. A newspaper in Toronto published a wedding announcement in 1862, Christian Bernard to Marie Colette Rousseau. No other details. No way to confirm it was the same person. The trail goes cold after that. Or rather, it splits into so many possible directions that following any single thread becomes impossible. Christian Bernard, if that was him, could have lived a long life in Canada, raised children, grown old, and died without ever revealing what had happened to him in Savannah. Or he could have changed his name again, moved west, disappeared into the expanding frontier where questions about provenance were less likely and less dangerous. Or he could have died in 1854 of cholera or typhoid or any of the dozen diseases that killed young men in the 1850 seconds and been buried in an unmarked grave somewhere between Georgia and wherever he was trying to reach. We don't know. We'll probably never know. But what we do know is this: Christian Beaumont was never recaptured. He never appeared in any Georgia legal records after March 1853. He was never sold. He was never enslaved. Which means, in the most important sense, he won. Auguste Beaumont lived for another 9 years, but they were not good years. The scandal of the attempted sale followed him for the rest of his life. Polite society in Charleston and Savannah didn't ostracize him exactly. His family name was too old, his wealth too significant, but they whispered, they speculated, they wondered. Did you hear Auguste Beaumont tried to sell his own grandson? I heard the boy was white-looking, absolutely white, and Auguste put him on the block anyway. I heard he forged documents, created false letters from legal authorities. I heard the boy declared himself free right there in the auction room. Can you imagine? Auguste's business continued. His plantations remained profitable, but his standing in society never fully recovered. Several families quietly severed connections. invitations became less frequent. His oldest son, Nathaniel, who had known nothing about Christian until the scandal erupted, barely spoke to him for the last 5 years of Auguste's life. In 1858, Auguste suffered what his doctor called an apoplectic fit, probably a stroke. It left him partially paralyzed on his left side and unable to speak clearly. He spent his final years in the Charleston townhouse, cared for by servants who pitied him and feared him in equal measure. One of those servants, a woman named Ruth, who had been with the Beaumont family for 30 years, later told her granddaughter a strange story. She said that in his final months, Auguste would sometimes cry out in his sleep, always the same words in French, "Les papiers. Où sont les papiers?" The papers. Where are the papers? Ruth said she went into his room one night after hearing him cry out, and found him sitting up in bed, trembling, pointing at shadows. "He's here," Auguste kept saying in his slurred speech. "The boy is here. He wants his papers back." "There's no one here, monsieur," Ruth told him gently. "You don't see him?" Auguste said. "He's standing right there. He looks exactly the same. He won't stop looking at me." Ruth told her granddaughter that she believed Auguste was being haunted, not by a ghost, but by guilt, by the knowledge of what he'd tried to do, by the inescapable memory of his grandson's face on that auction block, speaking the words that destroyed everything, "I am free." Auguste died on November 3rd, 1862, at age 80. The cause of death was listed as general decline. He was buried in the Beaumont family plot in Charleston. His gravestone makes no mention of his younger son Richard or his grandson Christian. As far as the official record is concerned, they never existed. But here's where the story gets truly strange. Here's where history blurs into conspiracy and unanswered questions. In 1864, in the chaos of the Civil War, someone broke into the Chatham County Courthouse in Savannah. They didn't steal money or valuables. They broke into the clerk's office and removed specific documents. Christian Beaumont's deposition, gone. The inventory of his papers, gone. Judge Morrison's ruling, gone. The auction house records from March 17, 1853, gone. It was surgical, precise. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for and took only those documents. The courthouse blamed Confederate raiders. Union forces blamed Confederate sympathizers trying to destroy records, but neither explanation made sense. Why would soldiers in the middle of a war care about a decade-old legal dispute? The Johnson Square auction house burned in 1866. The fire started in the basement, in the records room where bills of sale were kept. Every document from 1853 was destroyed. The fire was ruled accidental, but the timing was suspicious. In 1868, the Georgia state legislature passed an unusual resolution. It ordered the Chatham County Courthouse to seal all remaining records related to disputed status determinations from 1850 to 1854 for a period of 100 years. The resolution was sponsored by a state senator whose mother was a Beaumont cousin. It passed with minimal debate. In 1895, that 100-year seal was quietly extended, then extended again in 1920, then again in 1945. Each time, the official reason was the same: privacy concerns regarding potentially living descendants. But Christian would have been born in 1834. By 1895, he would have been 61. By 1968, when the seal should have expired, he would have been dead for decades. And privacy concerns typically don't extend to people who died a century ago. So why keep the records sealed? Researchers have been trying to answer that question since the 1960 seconds. Every formal request to open the records has been denied. Every legal challenge has failed. The files remain classified to this day, sitting in a restricted section of the Georgia State Archives that requires special permission even to enter. In 1961, a graduate student named Sarah Mitchell was doing research on antebellum Savannah when she made the discovery I mentioned at the beginning. She was examining the Johnson Square auction house building, which was being demolished to make way for a parking lot. In the basement, behind a loose brick, she found a small metal box. Inside was a bill of sale, dated March 17, 1853, for a male slave, age 19, final bid $12,400. But the sale was marked void in red ink, with a note, "Status disputed, remanded to court custody." There was also a letter in the box, written in careful handwriting on yellowed paper. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched Christian's deposition based on surviving courthouse records from other cases. The letter said, "To whoever finds this, my name is Christian Beaumont. I was born free. I was nearly sold as property by my own grandfather. I stood on an auction block in this building and declared my freedom, knowing it might cost me my life. I don't know if I will survive what comes next, but I want someone to know the truth. I want someone to know that I existed, that I was a person, that I refused to disappear. If you're reading this, then I left at least one mark. That has to be enough." Sarah Mitchell brought the box to her professor, who brought it to the university administration, who brought it to the state archives. Within a week, the box and its contents were classified. Mitchell was told her research topic was no longer viable and encouraged to choose something else. She switched to studying Savannah architecture and never spoke publicly about what she'd found. Except she did tell one person, her brother, who told his wife, who told her sister, who told her daughter. And that daughter, now in her 70s, posted the story on a genealogy forum in 2019. She included a photograph she claimed was of the letter, though the image quality was poor enough that authenticating the handwriting would be impossible. The post was deleted within 24 hours. The daughter received a cease and desist letter from the Georgia State Archives, claiming she was sharing classified government documents. She took down all references to the story and refused to discuss it further. But screenshots of her post circulated, and people started asking questions. Why would a state government care about a 170-year-old auction? What could possibly be in those sealed files that still matters? What are they protecting? There are theories. Here are the main ones. Theory 1. The records contain proof that Augusta Beaumont committed fraud. Not just the attempted sale of Christian, but extensive fraud. Forged documents, fabricated witnesses, bribed officials. If the full extent of his corruption were revealed, it would implicate other prominent families who were involved in or benefited from similar schemes. Families whose descendants still have political and economic power in Georgia. Theory 2. The records contain documentation of where Christian went and what name he used. And that documentation reveals something explosive. Perhaps he became successful under his new identity. Perhaps his descendants are prominent. Perhaps revealing his story would force uncomfortable conversations about race, identity, and historical injustice that certain interests would prefer to avoid. Theory 3. The records prove Christian was definitively free, which means his attempted sale was unambiguous kidnapping. Opening those records would establish legal precedent for thousands of similar cases from the antebellum period. Cases where free people were fraudulently enslaved. Cases that could, theoretically, have legal implications for descendants seeking reparations or historical acknowledgement. Theory 4. The records don't prove anything definitive, but they reveal a pattern. Not just Christian's case, but dozens or hundreds of similar cases. A systematic practice of enslaving free people through legal manipulation and document destruction. Evidence that would fundamentally change how we understand the scope of slavery and its mechanisms. Or maybe Theory 5. The records remain sealed simply because institutions resist transparency. Because once something is classified, declassifying it requires effort and justification. Because keeping secrets is easier than revealing them, especially when revelation serves no obvious institutional interest. We don't know which theory is correct. Maybe none of them. Maybe all of them. But here's what we do know. What the sealed records can't hide. Christian Beaumont stood on an auction block in Savannah in 1853 and said his own name. He claimed his identity in front of 200 witnesses. He forced a system designed to erase him, to acknowledge him, even if it couldn't figure out how to categorize him. And then he disappeared. Not because he was erased, but because he chose invisibility. Because he transformed himself into someone else, rather than accepting the identity Georgia tried to force on him. That's not erasure. That's resistance. That's refusing to let other people write your story. There's profound power in that refusal, in saying you don't get to define me and meaning it, in walking away from everything, your name, your history, your family, rather than accepting someone else's version of who you are. Christian should never have been on that auction block. Whether he was born free in Philadelphia or born enslaved in South Carolina or anywhere in between, the fact that his status as a human being could be debated, that his humanity was treated as a legal question requiring adjudication, tells us everything we need to know about the system that put him there. But his story also tells us something else, something about the power of speaking truth in spaces designed to silence you, about the courage it takes to say, "I am free," when every structure around you insists you're property. About choosing dignity, even when dignity has been legally stripped from you. This is exactly the kind of story we tell here at the Sealed Room. Stories they tried to bury, voices they tried to silence, truths that someone decided were too dangerous to acknowledge. Because every voice that speaks from the past, every story that survives despite efforts to erase it, changes how we understand who we are and where we came from. In 1897, 44 years after the auction, a researcher named Thomas Bradford was interviewing elderly residents of Savannah for a book on local history. One man, a former auctioneer named Williams, who had worked at Johnson Square in the 1850 seconds, told him about the most remarkable auction I ever witnessed. "There was a young man," Williams said, his voice still awed after all those years. "Most beautiful person I'd ever seen, man or woman, could have passed for white anywhere in the country. Maybe 19, 20 years old. They put him up for final lot, and the bidding went wild, hit 12,000 before it was done." 12,000? Bradford said, incredulous. "For one person." "Should have gone higher," Williams said. But then the damnedest thing happened. Right there on the block, with everyone watching, he declared himself free, said his name, his parentage, claimed he had papers. The whole room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. What happened? Sale got stopped. Legal mess. Never seen anything like it before or since. Williams paused. "You know what I remember most, though? Not the bidding, not the chaos. The way he stood. Free people stand different than enslaved people. They hold their heads different. That boy stood like he was free, even when he was on the auction block. Like he knew something we didn't. Like he knew we couldn't really touch him, even if we sold him." "Do you know what happened to him?" Bradford asked. Williams smiled. "No, and I think that's how he wanted it. I think he went somewhere cold, somewhere his face didn't mean anything. And I think he lived a long life without ever telling anyone what happened to him. Because some stories are too dangerous to tell. You carry them until you die, and then they die with you." "Do you think that's sad?" Bradford asked. "No," Williams said. "I think it's smart. Maybe the only way to really be free is to make sure no one can ever find you again. To become someone else so completely that the person who stood on that auction block ceases to exist." Bradford included this interview in his book, published in 1899. The book sold poorly and was largely forgotten, but a copy survived in the Savannah Public Library, and in 1973, a researcher named the interview in a footnote in an academic paper about auction practices. That footnote is one of the few published references to Christian Beaumont that escaped classification or suppression. So, what do you think? Do you believe Christian made it out? Do you think he lived a long life in Canada or California or somewhere else, dying peacefully in old age with children and grandchildren who never knew his real story? Or do you think something darker happened, that he didn't survive the journey north, that his disappearance was permanent in a different way. And why would Georgia keep those records sealed if there wasn't something explosive in them, something that still matters even now, 170 years later? What could possibly be so dangerous about a young man who declared himself free on an auction block in 1853? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you think happened to Christian Beaumont. Tell me if you think the records should be opened. Tell me if you've heard similar stories from your own family history, stories about people who fell through the cracks, who existed in that impossible space between free and enslaved, who had to fight just to prove they were human. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories they tried to seal in classified archives and burn in courthouse fires, then subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries, someone who believes that buried voices deserve to be heard, someone who understands that the past isn't really past until we've reckoned with it honestly. Because every view, every share, every comment helps bring these forgotten voices back, helps ensure that people like Christian Beaumont, who refused to be erased, who stood on an auction block and said their own names, don't disappear into silence. Maybe somewhere in some sealed file in Atlanta, the full truth about Christian Beaumont is still waiting. Maybe those files contain his papers, the ones Auguste confiscated. Maybe they contain evidence of where he went and who he became. Maybe they contain proof that he lived to old age, that he built a new life, that he won. Or maybe they contain something else. Something that explains why powerful people have spent 170 years making sure we can't see them. Either way, Christian made sure of one thing. He made sure we'd still be talking about him, still wondering, still searching, still asking the question that everyone in that auction room must have asked on March 17th, 1853. How does a man stand on an auction block in a system designed to strip him of everything and still somehow walk away free? The answer might be locked in those sealed files. Or it might be simpler than that. Maybe Christian understood something fundamental about freedom, that it's not just a legal status or a piece of paper, it's a refusal, a choice, a line you draw inside yourself that no one else can cross, no matter what they do to your body or your documentation or your name. Maybe he understood that the only way to truly be free was to become unfindable, to disappear so completely that even the people hunting you can only grasp at shadows. And if that's true, then Christian Beaumont wasn't just free. He was ungovernable, unownable, beyond the reach of everyone who tried to define him, categorize him, reduce him to property. That's why his story still matters. Not because we know how it ended, but because we know how it began. With a young man refusing to be silent, refusing to disappear, refusing to let anyone else tell him who he was. In a system designed to erase people like him, Christian made himself impossible to forget. And 170 years later, we're still here, still looking for him, still listening for his voice. Still trying to understand the impossible secret of the most expensive slave ever offered for sale in Savannah. The secret that he was never a slave at all.